the lecture series that we had running before COVID hit us. We're incredibly lucky to have Rebecca Sear here with us. We were hoping very much for Rebecca to be talking to us back in March. And Rebecca is the professor at London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine and the head of the Department of Population Health. I know Rebecca from a long time back when we were both studying PhDs at UCL, Rebecca with Ruth Mace and me with Leslie Aiello. And it's a shame that Rebecca hasn't been at RAG before, because she's studied so many of the subjects that we're really interested in, including matrilineal descent and inheritance, including cooperative childcare and grandmother hypothesis, and this subject that we're talking about today is the nuclear family a myth or reality, which Rebecca studies with a whole array of cross-cultural data from many different societies. Last week we had a session with a really good discussion on decolonizing education. But in some respects, this is about decolonizing reproduction, or I could argue that it is. So I'm handing over to Rebecca to give us some slides and some talk, and then we'll have questions and discussion. So please go on.
Thanks very much, Camilla. I was really delighted to get this invitation from you and Chris. I remember coming along to radical anthropology meetings when I was an MSc student, when I first came to London, many years ago now. So it's a real honour to now be back talking to you.
Great.
So I am going to show you a few slides to begin with. This is just the highlights of a longer talk that I've given a few times now on dispelling the myth of the nuclear family. So in popular culture, and in many academic disciplines as well, this picture on the slide here is thought to be the traditional human family. The traditional human family is often considered to be a nuclear family, and also quite an isolated one. Just the mother and father looking after their children with no help from any other family members. The traditional family is also often assumed to be one with an extreme division of labour, where mothers are responsible for caring for children and dads are responsible for feeding the family, and there's no overlap of roles. But there's a big problem with that model. That model is actually very unusual if you look at human families throughout all of human history and across different human cultures. In fact, that traditional human family actually seems to reflect the middle-class Western norms of the mid-20th century, when a lot of academic disciplines were really starting up, certainly in social science. And there are two features of that model that are really problematic if you look cross-culturally and throughout history. The first is this extreme division of labour, where men do the producing or the breadwinning, and women do the homemaking or raising children. The second problematic assumption is that the nuclear family is entirely autonomous, or atomized, it's sometimes referred to, in that they're assumed to be getting no help at all economically or in raising their children from anyone else. And it's these two features of the model that I hope I'm going to convince you by the end of this talk that are really quite problematic. So the first one about the extreme sexual division of labour, I think we can dismiss very quickly. This is a picture taken by Frank Marlowe, who sadly died quite recently, but I collaborated with him a few years ago. He was an anthropologist who worked with the Hadza, hunter-gatherers in Tanzania. And this is a picture of a husband and wife gathering together. They're engaged in productive labour together in order to feed their family and other members of their group. This, in fact, is a much more common picture of what feeding children actually looks like in most human families. Men and women cooperate in some way to produce food for their children. In fact, Barry Hewlett has done some research showing that on average, roughly speaking, women produce about half of the calories required to feed groups or children, and men contribute about half of the calories. This is true across hunter-gatherer societies and also across other subsistence societies like agriculturalists and so on. So we can very quickly dispel the myth that the traditional human family is one in which there's this extreme division of labour, male breadwinners and female homemakers. I want to spend a little bit more time on the second problematic feature of that so-called traditional human family. This is the idea that mothers and fathers don't get any help at all in raising their children. This is not, in fact, the case at all. Jumping to the conclusion again, across different human societies. I've spent most of my career now looking through data, looking for empirical evidence to see what the data actually show about whether mothers and fathers raise their children without any help, or whether other family members do in fact have very important inputs on raising children. My work has been very heavily influenced by Sarah Hrdy, another anthropologist, who has really promoted this idea that humans are cooperative breeders. What this means is that humans have a reproductive system where mothers need help to raise children. It's actually a pretty rare reproductive system across species. Something like just under 10% of bird species do it, but far fewer mammal species do it, although there are a few examples like meerkats and so on. So Sarah Hrdy has written some really nice work really promoting this idea that humans are cooperative breeders. And if you haven't read her book, Mothers and Others, I would highly recommend you do that, because it's written for a popular audience and it's a really nice account of the importance of cooperative breeding in human societies, and how in fact cooperative breeding may be the origins of a lot of human cooperative behaviour. We are generally quite a cooperative species. But the bit I'm largely going to skip over in this talk, if you've watched the longer talk, you'll have seen a lot more evidence presented on this topic. What I've shown in many different societies now, and looking at different outcomes, is that other family members do in fact seem to help mothers raise their children. What this slide I'm showing you now is, it's based on a review paper where we looked through the literature with a couple of my colleagues on the screen there, Ruth Mason, David Cole. We looked through all of the existing literature for other studies which have empirically examined whether there are associations between the presence of different kin members and, in this case, child survival. And what you see is that the presence of grandmothers tends to be very often associated with higher child survival rates. This suggests that grandmothers may actually be helping mothers out to raise children, and their help is so valuable it actually improves child survival rates. Children survive better if the grandmother's around. The hypothesis is supported by quite a lot of ethnographic evidence as well that shows that grandmothers really are directly caring for children, or they're helping mothers, and doing this, spending quite a lot of time in doing this kind of thing. I did some work a long time ago for my PhD, in fact, in the Gambia, where children are meant to be sent to their maternal grandmothers to forget the breast when the mothers want to wean the children. And the grandmothers traditionally are meant to prepare for the child's peanut mashes. So these are really high energy foods that the child eats. And in the Gambia, we see a very clear association between the presence of maternal grandmothers and higher child survival rates. So that is just one example of quite a lot of evidence now that I've amassed that there is empirical evidence that the presence of different family members is actually associated with better child health and better child survival. Skipping over all of that evidence, I'm just going to show you the conclusions from the longer talk here. It's not actually just grandmothers that are associated with better child health and survival. In higher mortality contexts, it's also the case that older siblings are often associated with better child health and survival. And you know from ethnographic evidence, older siblings are often doing a lot of childcare. They're looking after their younger siblings from often quite a young age. It's not just in terms of better health and survival as well that we see the influence of family members. There are also associations between the presence of kin, like a woman's parents or her parents-in-law, and her own fertility rates. The cooperative breeding hypothesis would predict that if women are getting help from their kin, this may allow them to also have, to speed up their birth rates, to have shorter birth intervals and a higher number of children overall. We might also predict that women's fertility decisions are affected by the presence of kin. If we are a cooperatively breeding species, then women need the cues that there's going to be help and support around them in order to decide to have a child, because that help in raising children is so important for mothers. So we see empirically these positive influences of kin, not just on better child health and survival, but also on slightly higher fertility rates. Now, there's interesting variation, though. There always is interesting variation cross-culturally when you look into the detail. For example, it's often maternal grandmothers rather than paternal grandmothers that are associated with positive child outcomes. I'm not going to go into the detail in too much detail right now. You can ask questions about that if you're interested later on. In the interest of time, I'll just quite quickly skip on through the rest of this slide. I won't also really cover the effects of fathers on child and maternal outcomes here. Again, if anybody's particularly interested in fathers, feel free to ask questions about that later. And I will just very briefly mention here that this cooperative breeding strategy it doesn't paint an entirely rosy picture, because it also opens up the possibility of conflict between family members. If women really need help to raise children, then there may be conflict within the family of who gets that help. For example, there may be conflict between mothers and their adolescent daughters about when adolescent daughters start having children. There may be some conflict over whether the mother herself continues to have children and gets help from her adolescent daughter, or whether the adolescent daughter starts to have children requiring help from her mother. So there is also some interesting evidence that this cooperative breeding strategy may open up the possibility of some conflict between family members. And I'm not going to say too much here because I want to spend the last couple of minutes of this introduction on the implications of this cooperative breeding strategy. So in the West, we do have this idea that the traditional human family is this nuclear family where mothers and fathers aren't really getting a lot of help for raising children. This model is very problematic, I think, for both mother's, father's health and child health. For example, if you think about maternal help, new mothers in many Western cultures are really pretty much abandoned after the birth of their child to get on with raising their child without a great deal of help. They may get some help shortly after the birth from certain people, and they may get help from the father who may be on paternity leave for a little while, but then when the father goes back to work, the mother is quite literally left alone with her baby for a very large part of the day. We also know that in Western cultures there are relatively high rates of postnatal depression, and it may be these two things are correlated. If mothers are effectively designed to require help with raising their children, if they're expected in Western cultures to be alone with their babies with no help whatsoever for most of the time, that is going to not going to benefit women's health, certainly not their mental health. But I also don't think this idea of the traditional nuclear family is particularly healthy for male health either. This idea that men should be able to entirely provision their families, for example, is quite an unusual idea throughout most of human history, because in most human families, in most human groups, mothers and fathers are cooperative. So putting all this pressure on the father to entirely feed his family with no help at all, that puts a lot of pressure on men. It may lead to some of the things we talk about, we refer to as toxic masculinity, the idea that men don't cry, that they have to deal with all of their problems alone without help. And it may also be reflected in relatively high male suicide rates. For younger men, at least in Western society, suicide is one of the biggest killers. So, and again, it may be these quite toxic ideas about what the traditional family should look like that are also not being very positive for paternal and male health. And finally, I'm not sure the atomized nuclear family is the ideal situation either for child health. For one thing, we know ethnographically that older children get a lot of practice in child rearing when they're still children, because they're doing a lot of sibling care. They're caring for their younger siblings or their younger cousins, nieces and nephews and so on. In Western cultures, children don't do that anymore. They spend all of their time in schools where they're interacting very largely with children who are pretty much exactly the same age as them. This is a very different situation to the way children are reared in most societies, where children are mixing with other children most of the time, but in mixed age peer groups, and also doing a lot of childcare themselves of younger siblings and so on. It may be that this doesn't allow children to develop parenting skills, which could cause problems later on in their life. I will also put on the slide here, I should tell you where this quote is from, a quote from Sarah Hurdy's book, Mothers and Others, that I just mentioned, which is about how social and cognitive skills may fail to develop if children are not being raised in these cooperative networks. The full quote, I think, is a very powerful one. If empathy and understanding develop only under particular rearing conditions, i.e. cooperative rearing conditions, and if an ever-increasing proportion of the species fails to encounter those conditions but nevertheless survives to reproduce, compassion and the quest for emotional connection may fade away as surely as sight in cave-dwelling fish. So that's not a very positive view of child health and the development of child's social, behavioural and cognitive skills if they're essentially trapped at home with their mothers the whole time rather than being reared in these cooperative networks. Very, very briefly, there are also implications for fertility decline. I think I'm not going to go through that in detail since I've taken up more than 10 minutes. I will just leave you with the take-home message that the picture that you see on the screen here is very definitely not the traditional human family. And I'm very happy to take any questions.
Excellent. Thank you so much for crashing that down. And some people may have seen Rebecca's longer talk. Are there any thoughts or questions anybody like to pick up on?
I'm curious as to how empathy is used in this context, because empathy is a highly contested term. And there's differences in like cognitive empathy versus affective empathy. So I was wondering if you'd like to elaborate on how you mean empathy in that context.
Yeah, that was a quote from Sarah Hurdy. So I'm going to say here that I'm not a psychologist and I'm not entirely aware of the distinctions between those different types of empathy. I think Sarah Hurdy's point was really that we're trying to develop in these cooperative rearing networks, and if children are not raised in these mutually cooperative rearing networks, then their social and cognitive skills will not develop as they mostly have in children throughout most of human history. One of the things that distinguishes our own species is our ability to get on with others, our ability to be empathetic, to understand what other people are thinking. And if we don't have much practice with interacting with a range of other people in childhood, those kinds of abilities may not develop very well.
It's maybe worth saying that Sarah Hurdy put cooperative breeding as the matrix for the emergence of intersubjectivity, our ability to mesh mental states in genus Homo. So I think that's where she's bringing this idea of empathy from. That would be, that maybe helps the answer, I don't know. But I'm not a psychologist either.
Hi, Rebecca. I have a question about overlapping generations, because obviously when we talk about grandmothers, we think of them as discrete generations, but actually grandmothers are often reproducing at the same time as some of their oldest kids. So I wonder how that influences cooperative care from that perspective, and the kind of back and forth of older daughters taking care of their younger siblings, but grandmothers taking care of their kids that are about the same age, and also how that might affect the kind of survivorship of and thriving of kids of different in different birth orders.
That's a really good question. So it's the case that there is often overlapping generations in terms of reproduction in high fertility societies. So grandmothers may still be having their own children when their oldest daughters are starting to have children themselves. So Christina Moyer and I built a model about this and whether there might be reproductive conflict around when the adolescent daughters start to have their children, based on the idea that there is essentially a competition between either the mother herself getting her older daughter to help her rear her next child, or the adolescent daughter getting the grandmother's help to rear her first child. and we suggested this might be why there's quite a common finding cross-culturally that if parents are still alive, children have a delayed start to reproduction. And we thought that this might reflect intergenerational conflict. Basically, it's older mothers delaying the start of their daughter's reproduction in order to still get help from their older daughters in raising the mother's children. So it does open up the possibility of reproductive conflict there. Having said that, though, or perhaps also to say on that point, there are also some cultures that have, blanking on the name of it, abstinence is the name I'm looking for. This is the idea that once a woman becomes a grandmother, she should stop having sex. That would effectively mean that she's going to have no more children. So there seem to be some cultures that may deal with this conflict by having a cultural rule that tells older women that they need to, it's no longer appropriate for them to continue having children once they've become a grandmother. So clearly there is conflict in some societies. But also there is a lot of cross-cultural variation in who is looking after children. So for example, in patrilocal societies where women move to their husband's family when they marry, it may be that then there is no conflict or much less conflict with their own mothers because they're getting help from the father's kin to raise children. So those might be societies in which older women continue to reproduce when their daughters are starting to have children themselves. So yeah, I think that's an interesting question. It can result in reproductive conflict, but you know, human variety is always so interesting. There's a lot of variation around that as well. Did you have another question? Did that answer your questions?
Yes, thank you.
Great, thank you.
Any more? Any further? Can I just push Rebecca a little on talking a bit more about sort of the way that Sarah Hrdy's book has kind of shifted perceptions and views, and actually, yeah, if anybody asked me which was the most important book to read on human evolution, I would definitely say Sarah Hrdy's book for the 21st century, definitely. And I used to teach it like chapter by chapter for my students. But I think that the lens of the nuclear family sometimes leads people to misread her message, because sometimes they collapse cooperative breeding back onto mummy and daddy as the pair bond. So I just wanted to hear from you what you think is, has Sarah Hrdy's book had enough impact in shifting people's perception, for instance, in influencing things like social policy or viewpoints towards social policy? What do you think?
No. I think Sarah Hrdy's ideas are accepted in evolutionary anthropology. Outside evolutionary anthropology, I don't think they're very widely accepted at all. And sadly, evolutionary anthropology is quite a niche group of people. I've been promoting her ideas in the other social sciences too. I think in demography now, because are beginning to be exposed to this idea about humans as cooperative breeders too. I don't think it's impacting at all yet. I think that's a really interesting question, because I think it gets to questions of how often don't engage sufficiently with policymakers when we really should be. I think this work really is policy relevant.
Yes.
But it's sometimes too easy to stay in our little bubble and not understand how we can cross those bridges and talk to policymakers.
Can I just say something about language, really, I suppose? I'm sometimes a bit surprised that Sarah and others who talk about cooperative breeding don't mention what seems to me, and always has seemed to me, an absolutely crucial, very, very interesting fact that pretty much all hunter-gatherers have what's called a classificatory system of kinship terminology. And the principle of that is it's, in shorthand, it's the equivalence of siblings. And it means that a woman will use the kinship term, my son, my daughter, for her sister's son or daughter. And in most of these languages, there's not even a word. I mean, you'd think that if there was some kind of pair bonding or nuclear family, there'd at least be a word for mummy or daddy, which didn't mean any one of a few dozen people. But no, hunter-gatherers, of course, you know, they will acknowledge that if what we would call the real mum would be maybe move slightly quicker when a kid falls over than the various other mums, but that's not publicly acknowledged. The institutional fact is that every child has got a pretty much indefinite range of people who will call mummy, and who will have that responsibility as acting as a mother. And I suppose I'm just saying, for me, it's quite important not to be too narrowly biological. I mean, we need to start with the biology. I'm totally firm on that one. But I'm sometimes slightly surprised that the institutional facts, the cultural facts, the symbolic facts, the linguistic facts don't get drawn in support of the whole mothers and others paradigm.
I think that's also an interesting point. I have completely been guilty of this in my own work, because I have focused very much on the effect of biological family members on child health and fertility. I guess in my defence there, I'd say that that's where the data is. There is data available on on whether grandmothers and grandfathers are around. It will be really interesting to look at slightly less closely related individuals or unrelated individuals to see their impact on child health, survival and so on, but the data often just isn't available. That, of course, that's how data is collected, so that's not necessarily an excuse. But yeah, I think it would be very interesting to broaden certainly the kind of work that I've done to look at the impact of other individuals as well.
So what are your policy or cultural recommendations based on, in light of this? Because I'd imagine it'd be very difficult to overhaul how we conceive of families in the West. So where do you recommend starting on a practical level?
On a practical level, I think one thing you can do is acknowledge that new mothers need a lot of support, for example, and make sure that that support is available to them. I think, so that is one very clear recommendation, but I think also it's about shifting cultures as well. So shifting the narrative so that new mothers are not expected to spend most of their time at home alone with their children, to shift the narrative so that it's perfectly acceptable for mothers to seek help if they need it. Because I think there can be some aspects of maternal guilt if mothers think they're expected to cope perfectly well with being alone at home with their kids all the time, and when that doesn't happen, they may feel like failures. So I think shifting the culture, shifting the narrative around that is important too, which would empower hopefully women to ask for more help when they need it, when they're struggling with their new children. But I also think there are also practical policy things that could be done in terms of supporting new mothers better in the months after birth. Of course, that does cost money, which is always the problem with policy recommendations. But I guess those are my two recommendations: trying to provide some kind of practical support for new mothers, and also trying to shift the culture and the narrative around what mothering should be.
Can I just go back to your data? Can you get any more granular in terms of, just going back to the biology, is it in terms of the outcomes and survivability rates of newborns, is it the same for male and female offspring and children who don't have any parents? Because, you know, a lot of adoption is a big thing these days, isn't it? Is it the same? Is it sort of the outcomes similar for all, you know, biologically, non-biologically related?
In terms of sex, there are sometimes some interesting interactions between the presence of different family members and the sex of children. So for my PhD, I looked in the Gambia and found that the presence of maternal grandmothers was associated with better child survival. That was true for both boys and girls. So I then looked at a data set from Malawi to test the same question, pretty much expecting to find that in Malawi too, grandmothers would be associated with higher child survival. That's not what I found. In fact, I found that maternal grandmothers were associated with higher child mortality rates, but only for female children, only for their granddaughters. So if the grandmother was around, the granddaughter actually was more likely to die, which was definitely not what I expected to find. If that was a situation, that was a matrilineal population. It was a subsistence agriculture population, where the land was pretty saturated. So I suspect what have been going on there is that there was competition within the matriline for resources, essentially. and that it wasn't a good thing for matrilines to have a lot of women, a lot of females in them, and that increased the mortality rates of granddaughters if there were already many women in that matriline. So there are sometimes some interesting findings along those lines to do with sex. I have to say, though, it's quite rare. In most cases, grandmothers are associated with better child health and survival. It's only very rare examples when they're not. You also asked, I think, about children without parents. It's very clear that children without mothers, at least in high mortality societies, have very low survival chances, at least if they lose their mothers when they're very young. So again, in the Gambia, there were 11 children that lost their mothers in the first year of life. All but one of them died. So children in societies with little health care stand few chances of survival if they lose their mothers when they're still breastfeeding. However, even in the Gambia, a situation without health care, children who lost their mothers when they were over 2 years old actually didn't seem to have lower survival chances than any other children. So even quite young children seemed able to survive the death of their mother, which again, I think is evidence for the cooperative breeding hypothesis, because somebody must have been looking after those 3 and 4 year old children. They weren't capable of surviving without help at all. And it was probably the grandmother or other female relatives that were stepping in when the mother was gone. So there are clear disadvantages to children without mothers, although they do tend to disappear for quite surprisingly young children. The loss of the father is a different matter entirely. In most cases, the loss of the father doesn't affect child survival rates. That is quite surprising if you're attached to the traditional nuclear family model, in which fathers are very important for children. But empirically, in many studies across the world, it looks like the loss of the father really doesn't make a great deal of difference to child survival. There are exceptions. There are some cases where child survival is lower without the father. But even in some of those cases, it seemed that that association may be to do with something like epidemics that killed several members of a family at the same time, rather than the death of the child being related to the loss of the father and the loss of whatever the father did for the child. Though that may be because what fathers do for children is much more substitutable than what mothers and other female kin do for children. Because if fathers are largely feeding children, for example, that is a role that can be taken over by somebody else. Breastfeeding is not something that's typically done by other women, so the loss of the mother is much more serious for child survival than the loss of the father. Does that answer your question?
And just to say, we heard from Mona Finnegan with the Benjedi that actually women tend to breastfeed one another's children quite a lot among the Benjedi, and those, of course, are forest hunter-gatherers, and so I would imagine that among hunter-gatherers, where they are gender egalitarian, as they mostly are in Africa, that's another issue. Then, in other words, they actually, quite a few different women will breastfeed for each other's children, which of course makes the point about using the same kinship term even more kind of logical, of course.
Mm-hmm. Perhaps actually to follow up on that, in the Gambia, it was also the case apparently that women did sometimes breastfeed each other's children, but I think that a child that is entirely without its mother needs a lot of breast milk, and it may be that in those situations, the other women around can't come up with enough breast milk to feed that child. Perhaps interestingly, in the Gambia, a midwife who spent a lot of time there did observe that women would sometimes feed each other's children if they were hungry or crying. But when she tried to do a survey about this and asked women about it, they all said they never did it. So for some reason, it seemed to be something that they didn't want to speak about, even though they were doing it, and it was clearly done in sight of.
I imagine the missionaries have told them off about it, probably.
Possibly, quite possibly.
Can I ask? Mary's got your hand up.
Yeah, hi, thanks. Hi, thank you, Rebecca. I was just wondering your thoughts. So the current crisis that we're living through at the moment, particularly looking at the West, I'm in Ireland at the moment, and obviously the same things are happening everywhere, but the nuclear family, which, as sort of a given in anthropology, it's not something that has existed across time and space, although that isn't something that is a general understanding of things. But when we've got this scenario now where So, you know, the private and the public sphere were more or less created with the advent of industrial capitalism and women entering the workforce. I've got my children here now coming to contribute. Sorry, just be quiet now. Case in point, I think. But so we've got this scenario now. So particularly in this country, there is absolutely no childcare being provided for any workers at all, including frontline healthcare workers. A lot of them are women and so on. And so it's just sort of, we're seeing this sort of falling apart of, I wouldn't say the nuclear family, but this idea of women's working and sharing of the burden and so on, when it's quite clear that isn't happening. So even in cases of you know, male and female partners with children, you know, all of the reports are coming out saying that women are doing a lot more of the childcare now under lockdown. Women's productivity is down, even in the academic sphere. There was a paper out recently about how men's publishing has gone up and women's has gone down in the last 2 months. And so I just think it's a very interesting moment to look at this idea of the nuclear family, you know, just given the current crisis. And I was just wondering if you had any thoughts on that at all.
Yeah, thanks for raising that point. I actually should have built this into my talk, because I think the current crisis is really demonstrating just how much of a myth the traditional nuclear family is. It really highlights how much childcare women and men were getting outside of the family before the crisis, effectively schools and daycare for smaller children too. Suddenly we have a situation where mothers and fathers are expected to look after their children entirely by themselves without help and continue working, and it's simply impossible. Yes, and we're having all of these gendered effects as well, with women doing a lot of childcare and their work suffering. So I think that the current pandemic is really highlighting just how much of a myth the traditional nuclear family is. We are cooperative breeders, and that's what this pandemic is showing us.
Great. Salma, did you have a question? You got your hand up.
Yeah, I did have a question, thanks.
Yeah.
Well, it's two questions actually. First of all, you mentioned that you might be able to say something about the role of fathers that you found out in your research. I was just curious about that. And also I was wondering whether, has anyone looked into, like, in cultures where it seems as though, for example, there isn't even the words to just, you know, that would say mother is one person only, or where there's a real cooperation between women in raising children. Has anyone looked at how that relates to the whole concept of the attachment system, where, like, in psychology, I think, and I'm not a psychologist or anything, but I think in Western psychology, there's been a lot of research about how infants are attached to their mothers in particular. But does that kind of spread around to, can infants be attached in that way to more than one person, or do you know anything about that?
Okay, you're breaking up a little bit there, but I think you had three questions. One was about fathers, one was about language, and one was about attachment theory.
Oh, so, yeah, that was just two questions. It was about basically what's the relationship between attachment theory and this concept of cooperative breeding, and if the child rearing is really shared like this amongst several individuals. Has anyone looked into the relationship between that and attachment theory?
I think that's also a really good question. Attachment theory is being criticised by anthropologists at the moment for being very Western-centric, because it is very much biased towards the mother-infant bond. Even fathers don't seem to get a look in, according to some psychologists I've spoken to. And that idea is really being criticised because it's very clear that children are getting a lot of care from multiple caregivers in most parts of the world. So I think attachment theory can be criticised, although perhaps not entirely thrown out. I think there may well be some truth to the idea that children do need to attach to caregivers, but it doesn't have to be one person. It doesn't have to be the mother. It can be, children can attach to multiple caregivers. So that's, in terms of the evidence though, and whether that's linked to differences in cooperative breeding strategies, again, that's a very good question. It's something I'd be quite interested in looking at myself, but I don't know if any research has been done on that yet. And in terms of fathers, yeah, the role of fathers is very interesting because it's very variable in different societies. First of all, it's quite clear that there do seem to be some adaptations for fathering in humans. Let me see if I can show you some additional slides here. So in the Gambia too, I've done a study of testosterone and fatherhood. Some of you may know that, let's see if I can share this slide. Some of you may know that in Western societies, being partnered or being a father is associated with lower testosterone. This has been suggested to be due to the fact that testosterone mediates a shift from investment in mating effort, looking for a partner, to investing in fathering, investing in looking after children instead. And that testosterone declines when men become partnered or become fathers in order that they direct their attentions towards their children rather than looking for additional mates. In the Gambia, we tested this hypothesis because the Gambia is a very polygynous population. Married men and men who are fathers are not necessarily no longer looking for additional partners because they can marry other women. See if I can find the right slide. There it is. And what we showed in the Gambia is that there isn't any difference between men who are partnered and men who are not partnered in terms of their testosterone, but there were some associations with fatherhood. Again, not in terms of whether men were fathers or weren't fathers. There was no difference in testosterone for men who were and weren't fathers, but men who were spending more time with their children, men who had more contact with their children, had lower testosterone than those who spent less time with their children. So we thought this was some evidence for this idea that testosterone does mediate the shift from mating effort to parenting effort, although the picture's a bit more complicated than it is in Western societies. But it's also the case that not all men invest in their children everywhere. Again, if you look back at this slide, looking at associations between child survival and the presence of fathers, in only about a third of populations was there an association between the presence of the father and child survival. So it's clear that, stop sharing that now. It's clear that the role of the father in different societies is very variable. And it may be, again, that this is because the role of the father is more substitutable than that of mothers or grandmothers. It may be shared out between lots of different individuals. It may also be shared out between different men. It may be that children are getting investment from men who aren't their fathers, and that's why the presence or absence of the child's biological father doesn't matter too much, going back again, I guess, to Chris's point about more general cooperation in human groups. So you may well know about particle paternity societies in South America. These are societies where children are acknowledged to have more than one father. Any man who has sex with the mother around her pregnancy is assumed to be a father of the child, and he's expected to do a bit of provisioning, that kind of thing. So it may be in some situations children are getting investment from men, but from men who are not their fathers. So although having some kind of male input is important to raise those children, it doesn't have to be the father. I think the role of fathers is very interesting cross-culturally because it is so variable. Answer your questions?
Yeah, great, thank you. Really interesting, thanks.
You shouldn't forget the mother's brothers either. So important for a cut. I mean, fathers come and go, but kin are forever. And a mother's brother, even if he's not all that brilliant at sort of tactile affection and caring, he's going to be there. In nearly all traditional societies in Africa and so many other places, of course. There is, again, with all the stereotypes, far too much assumption about it's going to be, men are going to be, sexually active, and the whole category of brothers as caregivers is kind of hugely underestimated, it seems to me.
Christina, did you have a question? Christina? Yeah.
Yes. Hi, Rebecca. Thank you very much for your work. Just real quick, have you happened to find that there's an average number of I watched your video. I got halfway through the homework, but have you found that there's been an average number of mothers, of parents for co-parenting? No. It takes
I haven't been able to look at that because the data isn't often available. I have mostly focused on looking at the influence of particular family members, like the father or the grandmothers or the older siblings, just because data isn't available often on who else is caring for children. So I'm afraid the answer to your question is no, I just don't know.
Okay. Well, thank you anyway.
Selma's got her hand up again, I think.
No, sorry, I think I just forgot to put my hand down. Well, I'll put it back down again.
Anne, were you going to say anything? You've got to, if you want to speak, you've got to unmute yourself.
I'm done that. I've unmuted myself. Yes. Okay. Is that okay now? Can you hear me?
Yes. Yes.
Can you hear me now? Yeah. Okay. Yes. This phrase keeps coming back to me. It takes a whole village to raise a child, and I think that's where the nuclear family falls down really badly, because inevitably it will break up because there's too many strains put on and too many demands made on just two adults. Can you hear me?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay. And when if the nuclear family breaks up, then there's even less support for the children. But in a matrilineal kinship system, when the mother ceases her sexual relationship, with a sexual partner, then the children still have the security and the stability of the wider kin to care and nurture for them. And I think the other negative aspect, which we haven't sort of talked about at all here on the nuclear family, is the control of the sexual behaviour, particularly of the woman in the nuclear family. Whereas in a matrilineal kinship system, who a woman has sex with is of really no concern to anyone but the woman herself. And so in a matrilineal kinship system, you've got the separation between the familial and the sexual relationship. And there's, I think, the quote could I just quote something which I just think it always sort of struck me really, is something that Malinowski said when he was writing. He's an anthropologist who was writing about whether the nuclear family had always existed. And he says, "I believe that the most disruptive element in the modern revolutionary tendencies is the idea that parenthood can be made collective. If once we came to that point of view, the point of doing away with the individual family as a pivotal element of our society, we should be faced with a social catastrophe compared with which the political upheavals of the French Revolution and the economic changes of Bolshevism are insignificant." So the question, therefore, as to whether group motherhood as an institution, whichever existed, whether it is an arrangement which is compatible with human nature and social order, is of considerable practical interest. And of course, group motherhood challenges the very fundamental sort of tenets of patriarchy. And although, I grew up myself in a nuclear family, but when I split with my partner and became a single parent, I actually gained more support through the women's movement, through particular women in the women's movement, my family and kin, and I went to live with a couple and raised children with them. And I think if I hadn't have had the support as a single parent of family, friends and kin, I wouldn't probably have had a third child. And, my mum looked after my sister and my children, and we've always looked after our grandchildren. And that has enabled me, in addition to, being able to work and have a wide kinship support, and obviously I have helped friends and family look after their children. It's not just been one way, but it's also enabled me to be much more sexually liberated, because I have never lived with a sexual partner, and I've been able to have sexual relationships outside, as I say, because I've had the wider sort of kinship support from my family and friends to be able to do that. So I think debunking the nuclear family is really, really important. it's been crucial to my life. And, you know, the whole idea that maternal kinship systems actually existed, I've held on to, because I have tried in my actual practice as much as I can in Southeast London to be able to do that. So that's what I've benefited from living, as I say, trying to live outside the nuclear family, because it's just much more supportive. Yeah.
Thank you for your comment. I think that raises several really interesting and important points. Just to pick up on a couple of things, you started off by saying the nuclear family is risky. I completely agree.
Yeah, yeah.
You don't actually need to be an evolutionary anthropologist to realise that it's just not a very good model if you just think about it for a few minutes.
It's unsustainable.
Yeah.
Unsustainable.
If you think of a hunter-gatherer society where, you know, mum sat at home raising kids, dad went out hunting mammoth, and the dad gets run over by a mammoth one day, then that's the end of that family. You know, the woman can't feed her children or herself because that's not what she does. All her children die. She immediately needs to find another partner who can feed her. It's just not a good system for anybody. It also means that the hunter who got run over by the mammoth also loses all of his genetic investment too. So you only have to think about the nuclear family model for a few minutes to realise it's just not a very good system. And I think it really only is so prominent in low mortality societies where it is actually where most people can form long-term partnerships that do last into old age. So I completely agree about how the nuclear family is just too risky. Cooperative reproduction is effectively a way of spreading risk, and I think it's hugely important in more risky environments, which has been most of human history. Another point about when the actual origins of the male breadwinner, female homemaker model. Somebody else I think mentioned this earlier. It was the Industrial Revolution that seems to have created this idea that the traditional human family is the male breadwinner, female homemaker model, because the Industrial Revolution did allow men to more or less feed their children, their families by themselves through wage labour. But it also changed a lot about family structures and family systems. There's another lovely quote by a demographer, Alec Abasu, who talks about, in demography, there's this idea that fertility has declined. Fertility's declined very dramatically worldwide over the last couple of centuries, rather. And there's quite a prominent idea in demography that fertility declines when women become empowered, because when women are empowered, they choose to have small families. There are lots of problematic assumptions around that, but Basu says it's actually the reverse. The Industrial Revolution clamped down on women's autonomy because it created these male breadwinner, female homemaker models. It pushed women into the home where they hadn't been before. It took their autonomy, their earning power effectively away from them. And that's when fertility declined, because when women don't have autonomy, when they don't have support to raise children, having lots of children isn't a very good thing to do, because you have to raise them by yourself. So it seems that the actual origins of the male breadwinner, female homemaker nuclear family were the Industrial Revolution. Before that, it wasn't widespread at all. So yeah, I think you have some really interesting points there. Maybe just to finish too, although it is a relatively novel idea, this traditional human family, it seems to be a really sticky one. I recently, in the last couple of weeks, came across an article from 1959 that essentially said the traditional isolated nuclear family is a myth. It collected some data from America, where this myth was very prominent in the 1950s, of what the traditional human family looked like. And it said this idea that family structure is an atomized nuclear family is a myth. Families are getting a lot of help from their kin support networks. They are not economically independent. That was an article that was published in 1959. And yet still in many academic disciplines, there's this idea, and in public discourse as well, there's this idea that the traditional human family is the atomized nuclear family. So it's a very sticky idea, even though it's not a very good one.
Camilla's telling me that she's phasing out because of her iPhone, so she's asked me to kind of chair this if she's not able to come back in. I can't see any hands. Maybe I should look a bit harder down. Has anyone got their hand up?
I can ask another question.
Oh, well done, Camilla, you're back.
Get back in. I keep hearing and missing, so maybe my question will ask to repeat. I'm special because RAG has this tendency to see matrilineal priority, and picking up from Sarah Hurdy that it would have been mother and mother's mother as like the original kind of cooperative pair, maybe. The differences between mother's mother and the father's mother in terms of strategies is obviously really interesting. And a lot of your work and your reviews has suggested that the mother's mother has probably a greater positivity overall compared to the father's mother, that there may be different contributions, obviously. How consistent is that? Can we see the mother's mother as kind of supporting with a sort of quality perspective, and the father's mother tending to push more kind of quantity and fertility perspective? What would you say to that?
If you look at the empirical evidence, it does look...
Did you hear?
Grandmothers... Yeah, can you hear me?
Did we hear? Oh, frozen.
Okay. If you look at the empirical evidence, it does look like maternal grandmothers seem to be more likely to improve child well-being, and the paternal grandmother, or the mother's mother-in-law, is more likely to increase women's fertility. And that has been interpreted as the mother's mother being most concerned about the quality of children, the father's mother being more concerned about having lots of children, even if that comes at a cost to the woman's own health, because the husband's mother is not directly related to the wife, and therefore she is less concerned with the wife's health. The empirical evidence is quite consistent with that maternal grandmothers do more to improve child quality, paternal grandmothers do more to increase women's fertility. But a postdoc that worked with me, Christina Moyer, for a while, really didn't like the idea that there was sexual conflict between women and their husbands and their husband's mother that was increasing their fertility. She argues that because most human relationships are monogamous, then husbands and wives' interests are actually mostly aligned. So there shouldn't be this desire on the part of the husband or his mother to increase the woman's fertility, because if the woman is essentially killed off because she has too many children, the husband may then therefore not get himself another wife, so that's the end of his own reproductive success as well. So that idea that paternal grandmothers are more interested in quantity of children, it does fit with the empirical evidence, but theoretically I'm not totally convinced by it. It may be that there are other explanations for it. And in fact, one of Christina's explanations is that women are actually exploiting their mothers-in-law by having lots of children very quickly when they live in patrilineal situations and when they live in matrilineal situations. Because in patrilineal situations, women aren't genetically related to the other individuals. So what women should do in that case is have lots of children and make sure all of those unrelated individuals give her lots of help to raise her children. In a matrilineal situation where she's more related to people, she should be more concerned about also providing some care to those people, to those people's children, and shouldn't be so selfishly trying to produce as many kids of her own that she can. So it may be that there's actually an alternative explanation to that association between the mother-in-law and higher fertility of the woman.
I can see Sheena's hand up, and I can see Mark Jamison's hand up. Sheena.
Hi. I'm curious if you could talk a little bit more about society, because we talk a lot about like matrilocal, patrilocal societies, but there are a lot of societies where you have a lot of freedom and you might be bilocal and you could follow the better allo parents. So I'm wondering if in your research you found that there is an effect of bilocality or mobility in increasing child survivorship and allo care cross-culturally compared to where you don't have as much freedom in terms of where you live.
Unfortunately, there isn't really enough data to look at that yet. A lot of the data on child survival, for example, comes from agricultural societies where you don't have much freedom. They're largely either patrilineal or matrilineal. Having said that, the Gambian population that I've studied is actually patrilineal. Nevertheless, the maternal grandmother has a very significant positive impact on child survival because most women actually stay in their families' villages when they marry. So even though they may be theoretically living, or well, they may actually be living with their husband, the mother is only 3 compounds away. So it's kind of a biolocal society. But I don't think there's quite enough data to really look at that in a lot of detail. And with hunter-gatherer societies where there may be a lot more flexibility, there's often not that much data on things like child survival that will really let us test that. The only thing we have found is we did look at, with Christina, we looked at the association between parents and age at first birth. And that we found to be less likely, or rather the effect of parents delaying their children's first birth was less likely in buy local societies. So where children could choose where to live, there seemed to be less conflict between parents and the adolescent's age at first birth, which is possibly some evidence that where people have flexibility, they can manage these reproductive conflicts a little bit more. But it's an interesting question. I think more data on it would be really good.
Mark Jamison.
Oh, hello. Thanks. Yeah, one of the points I wanted to make was, well, not a point, but just an observation really, was that in terms of the nuclear family being perhaps something of a myth in the West even, that there's Bob Simpson's published an article in JRAI about 18 years ago called The Unclear Family, which is, you might like a look at if you haven't already done so. Unclear, nuclear, get it, you know. The other thing I was also wanted to ask you, perhaps you might want to talk about, is that I worked quite extensively in matrilineal societies in Skeeter and Ulwa. And what I found often is what's also very important is the mother's sister in those societies or in those cultures. It's not to in any way downplay the grandmother. I've seen instances of where the grandmother has actually detailed one of her unmarried daughters to help one of her other daughters who's perhaps struggling a little bit and so forth. But this cooperation between kind of adult sisters goes on into adulthood, even when the grandmother may be dead or infirm or whatever, that you have this cooperation between sisters is something which is very important as well.
You talked about the Confederacy of Sisters, Mark, didn't you?
Well, that was the term I've used in one or two papers, I think, yeah.
Thanks for that. Interesting points. Again, just briefly on your first point, it is absolutely not a novel idea that the nuclear family is a myth. Absolutely not. It's been, the same argument has been made by many people many times, but it's something that doesn't seem to have leapt out of anthropology, really. Even academic disciplines like sociology, for example, seem very wedded to this idea that the traditional human family is a nuclear family. So this really isn't a new point at all, but it's one that seems to be, the myth seems to be very hard to dispel. And I think it's quite interesting. That fact itself is quite interesting. Not entirely sure of the cause of it. In terms of cooperation between adult sisters, yes, again, human families are very flexible. Often women are getting help from all kinds of different sources, which can be cross-culturally variable. Again, humans are just really interesting in their variation.
I thought I'd just come in there in support of Anne's passage from Bronislaw Malinowski. I mean, because you were saying we're not quite sure why the myth of the nuclear family hangs around so much. I mean, in the late 19th century, of course, the dominant paradigm was the sort of matrilineal clan as the earliest form of human family. And I mean, Malinowski, in the quote that Anne read out to us, makes absolutely clear why he thought that's got to stop. I mean, it's simply because he was saying we feel threatened in our own home. The rise of, the Russian Revolution, all kinds of other revolutionary, and particularly the rise of feminism. He said, even in the privacy of our own home, we feel threatened. And so, I mean, I'm just saying it's just so clearly political that this ridiculous myth hangs around for so long. I mean, it's a particular political ideology, isn't it? I mean, there's no other explanation for it. I was just going to add again in support of Anne's point about sex. I mean, again, the dominant view in evolutionary psychology, Steven Pinker and so many other people, is looking at human evolution and working out how was it that the brain of say Homo erectus began to get large, twice the size of a chimpanzee's, and eventually with sapiens 3 times as big, is because of the contribution of the male. And the overwhelming theory there is that no male would support a female if he or provide for her children if he wasn't certain of paternity. And so the argument is going right back to Homo habilis, or even before. You know, you've got these males ensuring that their wives are faithful to them. I mean, you know, and so, I mean, what could be more ideological? I mean, how on earth could these males in that distant era ensure that their sexual partners would be faithful? It's just beyond me. And what other primates is that even vaguely possible? So there seems to be such a lot of explicitly political ideology, which of course then creeps into sociology and evolutionary psychology and all these other disciplines. And anthropology is the one place where you get a little bit of sort of self-reflection, a little bit of comparative data, a little bit of sort of, you know, willingness to sort of look at your own culture through the eyes of other cultures, which of course is exactly what you're doing so beautifully, Rebecca. But I just think now and again we must remind ourselves we need to get out of politics. We need to put science first, but it's hard. It's very hard to make, you know, to avoid the fact that politics unfortunately keeps on interfering, and it's not very pleasant politics.
Yeah, thank you, Chris. To pick up on a couple of those points, yeah, the idea that men need paternity certainty, I think, was very nicely undermined by Brooke Schelzer's recent paper, showing that almost half of children in the population in Namibia were not fathered by the woman's primary partner. They were extra pair, the result of extra pair copulations in biological language. And that, according to Brooke, an anthropologist, is a society where men are not meant to be jealous if their partner has other relationships, and meant to invest in children that are not their own. There are cultural norms around these things. So it's not the case that human males are universally designed to require fidelity from their partners and only invest in their own biological children. That's simply not the case. It is a political ideology. But I think fighting against political ideologies is so difficult because by presenting the science and saying this is not what humans are actually like, look at the empirical data, you are then accused of political ideology of your own. It tends to be those of the more right-wing political ideologies who insist they are the ones who are driven by science, they are the ones who are not driven by ideology. And it's a very difficult argument to fight. Yeah. So yeah, I completely agree. It's more political, but it's so difficult to say this is simply the science because you'll be accused of political ideology yourself, and none of us are free of political ideology either, which makes it even harder to fight.
Christina,
real quick, Rebecca, where was this? What? In which society is that?
The Himba of Namibia.
The Himba of Namibia.
Himba.
The Himba. Just to say to everybody, these are the people who still do what we think was done when we first became symbolic humans. But in RAG, we consider that the use of red ochre as a cosmetic all over the body was the first form of art. The first form of art wasn't on cave walls, it was actually on the body, and in particular on women's bodies. And I mean, anyone who has, if you haven't seen these beautiful pictures of the Himba, and completely covered in this gorgeous red ochre and showing their solidarity by all being painted up in the same way, I don't know, you're missing out. And there was even a strange TV program about the neighbours next door, where they had a sort of they had an upstairs downstairs sort of semi-detached house built right next to them, the Himba, and just to bring out the difference in sort of, you know, family styles, but also, I mean, views on, for example, so-called nakedness. I mean, the women there, the Himba, they were very well clothed. Westerners would say they're naked, but they were completely beautifully dressed in their red ochre. Yes. And it was just a fascinating description of culture clash, which actually was for a popular audience, but I thought it made a lot of very interesting, very valuable points. So yeah, the Himba. Yeah, but I didn't.
That would be Brooke Schelzer's work with the Himba. It's worth saying the Himba are not hunter-gatherers. They have quite a bit of livestock, but quite unusually for pastoralist societies, women maintain a great deal of freedom and decision making. It's quite surprising.
Yeah, thanks for reminding us of that, Rebecca. Yeah. It's really very, very, very important. Yeah. I can't see anyone's hand up. Where are these hands? Why isn't everyone's hand up?
Yeah.
No one's hands up. Come on.
Danny, you were saying that there was an article in the Atlantic about the nuclear family being a great mistake. Can you say any more?
Yes, I'm actually a family therapist in the NHS, you know, so I'm very interested in this subject. I think about attachment, see, to me, attachment is a much broader subject than often it's given credit for. And the point of attachment is so children have a safe internal working model of the world. It's not so they bond with one necessarily person, you know, and often in our work, we're helping children who have came through the care system and have to, you know, we have to repair and rebuild attachments. I will talk about the Atlantic article because it's interesting. I don't know if anyone's read it. It's more a magazine article, you know, but it basically says that hunter-gathering societies it's referring to were not necessarily linked genetically. They were more linked by choice, if you like. So, you know, you're obviously the anthropologist. You can say what you think about that. But in family therapy really is a creation of the nuclear family in America. And our journals in our journal are now translated into Mandarin. And that's because in China, the same thing is happening. People moving from the countryside into the cities, you know, village families being broken up effectively and nuclear families being formed. So we know this. But we also know that the feeling that your family isn't normal, there's something wrong about your family, is one of the main reasons for psychological distress. You know, and people who don't feel, like I was talking about children who are looked after, people who don't fit in to the accepted norms of what we think families are more vulnerable to psychological distress because they're not validated, if you like, you know, and often there's reasons. So I think for me, we know these things. The question is, can we do anything different in the society that we live in, or can we not? You know, because people do try, you know, to live in different ways, but I think it's quite hard, you know. So in my job, we sort of like pick up the pieces of this, and we try and help people heal and recover, and validate difference, because the point for us is love and safety, and you know that's the point. You know, not the way you do it. But it is hard, you know, and I guess for me that's why I'm more politically minded myself, you know, about changing the actual society that we live in, really, rather than trying to change it ourselves. Like,
I think that's a really important point. Cultural norms are so important to humans. We're a cultural species. So if we think that our cultural norm is a male breadwinning, female homemaking nuclear family, and we don't fit it, that causes distress. And it may be why in Western societies, the absence of the father from a family does seem to be associated with more detrimental outcomes for children than it does in societies that don't have the nuclear family norm. But I think that it's about shifting the narrative and being much more accepting of diversity and acknowledging and making very clear that there are many families out there that don't fit what is supposed to be the traditional human family. I think socioeconomic disadvantage also comes in here, because the male breadwinning, particularly female homemaking form of the nuclear family, is much more possible if you're rich, because men can earn enough to feed an entire family if they earn a large salary. If you're less rich, that model is much harder to sustain. So it's not actually just a Western model, this supposedly traditional nuclear family, it's a rich person's Western model. And I think making clear that's the case showing that families are actually much more diverse than they're supposed to be according to this cultural norm, and accepting that diversity is really important in reducing people's distress if they don't fit what they think is the norm. I think that's a really important point. Shifting cultural norms is hugely important, challenging, but very important to do. Chris, you're muted.
Yes, I was going to say, can we bring in anyone else? I can see Jane Jones, who's got a lot of knowledge about some of these things, and Ingrid, of course. Ingrid Lewis has got a lot of knowledge about collective childcare and stuff. Anyone else want to come in on this? Yeah. We've got some real experts around, but everyone's a bit quiet. Ingrid, are you there? Do you want to say anything about the bid?
Yeah, hi. Brilliant. I'm really enjoying this. I'm just listening. Sorry, yeah, I think, what we ritually really do in Western society is keep women apart. Already, when a woman becomes pregnant, it is difficult because the employer will say, oh God, another one going on maternity leave. Whereas, in societies like in Africa where we lived, it is an asset. It's wonderful. Every baby is greeted. And talking about sort of alloparenting and sharing breastfeeding, living with the Bayaka in Congo hunter-gatherers, I thought as well that breastfeeding is more within the group of the mother and the sisters. And to my surprise, I saw that actually some of the sisters were rejected because the women said, well, this sister of mine is sleeping around, so I'm definitely not having that breast milk go into my baby. So any lap is a good lap, whether that is kin or not kin. It is the feminine group, and it's obviously, when you have got a baby and you're all alone with it, it's very, very difficult. We had here in our friendship circle 2 PhD friends who Googled how to pick up a baby because they had nobody around. Parents were very far away and they didn't know what to do, because this is what our society has led us to believe, this nuclear family. Whereas in Africa, what we could observe is that it's absolutely normal, that if you want to have a break, there's just a lap in which you can plonk your baby, and that person will also breastfeed your baby, if that is what you do. So I'm just wondering how for really, really pushing for policy change, what would you see the first step? Rebecca.
That is a really good question, and I'm not sure what the answer to it is. I should engage more with policymakers, but I think the problem is that the science is often not that clear cut. As a scientist, you always emphasize, well, certainly as an anthropologist, you're always keen to emphasize variation. Not every human does exactly the same thing. So making very easy policy recommendations, I think, is not that easy, because it's not all a one-size-fits-all approach. Having said that, again, I think acknowledging that new mothers is something that could be recognised more in policy around maternity and childbirth. I think also, to spin off on what you were saying, I think something else that's very interesting about humans is how reliant we are on social learning to learn stuff, and that includes childcare, even breastfeeding, in fact. I find it really interesting that breastfeeding is a learnt behaviour. It is very difficult to do if you've never seen anybody do it, if you've not, when you're trying to do it for the first time. It's something that you have to learn from other women. And when we have these cooperative child caring networks where girls and boys, for that matter, from childhood are around children a lot of the time, where they're interacting with children for most of their lives, it's much easier to pick up the skills of childcare, including breastfeeding, than it is if you're in a Western society where you really have very little contact with children until you have your own, and then you're suddenly left alone to try and care for it. So I do think that is a problematic model, but again, exactly what the policy recommendations are, except to provide support to new mothers, I think is quite difficult. And again, it also requires shifting this narrative, shifting this idea that the nuclear family is the traditional model, and acknowledging that women really need a lot of help and support. They need to learn how to care for children, as do men for that matter. It's not just, obviously it's not just mothers who care for their children, that both mothers and fathers really need to learn childcare and need a lot of support how to do that. To acknowledge that might be the first step.
Thank you, Rebecca. What I thought, we had a very nice initiative, a government-led initiative called Sure Start for young families. And at that time, I helped with Sure Start for about 6 years. And I think what we could observe is getting women from certain social backgrounds together, that having that support network definitely really helped into better parenting, because we promoted alloparenting. Again, this is no government will, this was axed, and therefore there was no longer any funding. So perhaps as a policy recommendation to reinstate initiatives like that would be already a good start. And also, I guess there's something where we need to shift in our understanding of what feminism, so to speak, really is and means. Any thoughts to that, Rebecca?
With regards to Sure Start, yes, I think providing more childcare, government-funded childcare, would certainly be a good thing. That's high quality, and maybe centres where mothers can get together rather than have their child cared for as well. In terms of your point about feminism, could you say a bit more about that?
Well, very often when we have got discussions about women's biology or women's, reproductive capacities, and speak about hunter-gatherer societies, where Bayaka women, for instance, are very proud and very happy of their femininity and of their own sexuality and that power of giving birth. They celebrate this. Very much so, and often enforce this. Whereas in Western society, when you speak about these, sex strikes, feminists often say, well, dare you reduce us to our biology to just, produce babies for society. So I just wondered what your thoughts were on that.
That has led me on to another thought, which is that I do think some of the issues with the way that women are viewed in Western societies might also be linked back to the problematic traditional nuclear family model. In the traditional nuclear family model, women are only valued as mothers, as people who raise children. Grandmothers, for example, are not valued because they're not assumed to have a role in society. And I think some of the problematic aspects about how women are viewed only for what they look like, for being young, for example, may relate back also to this traditional nuclear family model. In societies where grandmothers are acknowledged to have a much more important role in society, you may have a slightly different view of what a woman is, how women are viewed, for example. I don't think that answers at all your question about feminism and whether women should simply be viewed as their bodies or not. I don't think they should. I think that women should be free to do whatever they want with their lives and their bodies, whether that involves having children, not having children. But I still don't think I'm quite answering your question.
Sorry, that was a bit of a rambly one. No, that's fine. Thank you.
Can I try and ask another question before I get cut off again? Which is about teenage motherhood. It kind of, at a tangent to demography, perhaps, and age at first birth. So for hunter-gatherers, a teenage mum, maybe late teenage mum, is natural and normal and really desirable from the point of view of health of a young woman and how, when she has children. But Western society, and particularly the last few decades, we think of Daily Mail readers demonizing teenage mums. what do you think about this kind of mismatch of demography in our kind of evolutionary past with the attitude towards teenage mums in view of thinking about support to young mothers? Something on that.
That's an example that I use with my demography students to talk about differing cultural norms, because they are mostly from Western backgrounds where the idea of teenage pregnancies is terrifying to them. And yet I point out that throughout most of human history and in many cultures today, teenage pregnancy is entirely normal. And as you say, it may have health benefits. Late teenage pregnancy, at least, not very early teenage pregnancy. That's a cultural norm that teenage pregnancy is demonized, which I think relates back to political ideology and this idea that we all need to be, productive, rich members of society. And the political ideology at the moment is that if you drop out of school and have a child when you're very young, then you're not being a productive member of society because you're not staying in education so that you can earn more in the future. So I think that's a very much a political ideology, and there certainly is a mismatch there between our evolutionary history and that particular political ideology. I think though it leads to quite problematic policy recommendations, because for a long time the policy to try and prevent teenage pregnancy, which was a goal, was to try and educate women and tell them about contraception, for example, which was kind of based on the assumption that teenage mothers are effectively too stupid to use contraception effectively, or that they didn't know about it. And that, of course, isn't the case. It's when women decide to have their children, it's largely quite a strategic decision, not necessarily a conscious one. But for women who won't benefit by staying for a very long time in university, it is better to have your children relatively young for all kinds of reasons, including that you then get help from your mother while she is still young enough to give you, and young and healthy enough to give you good help. So I think that political ideology does lead to policies which are not going to work to achieve the aim that they want to achieve, because educating about contraception isn't really the way to stop teenage pregnancy.
Great. Are there any more questions? Because perhaps people are winding up before 8 o'clock, and it may be time to bring this discussion to an end. Does anybody else want to pop in with something?
I just wanted to know what was next, Rebecca. What's next for you?
I'm becoming increasingly interested in inequalities, socioeconomic inequalities. So I have another line of research that tries to understand socioeconomic inequalities better, particularly in high-income countries. And I think it's to do with how the environment shifts our optimal behaviour. And in high-income populations, environments are very different and shift behaviours towards different optimum. For example, if you're in a disadvantaged environment, it's strategic to have your children young, for example, whereas if you're in a more advantaged environment, it's more strategic to have your children older. So health inequalities, rather, is something I'm becoming particularly interested in, and its relation to families and family structure, because there are differences in family structure in terms of advantaged and disadvantaged groups in the UK. So inequalities is where I'm going next.
Excellent. Ooh. Brilliant. Yeah, that sounds like a very good avenue. Does somebody else want a question quickly? Anybody else going to do? I think perhaps it's time. We're nearly 8 o'clock here, and it's time we said thank you. I know that quite a few people are having to leave, and they're all very really been very interested in everything Rebecca's had to say. It's thrown so much light on the variety of human families, the very different strategies, the ways that inequality and maybe impinging on reproductive strategies is certainly something we absolutely should be thinking of. So I said at the beginning, this is kind of an effort to decolonize reproduction, and I think that would be a strong way to look at it. RAG is doing its utmost to start decolonizing. So this has been an excellent session for giving us some perspectives on that. So I really like to say thank you to Rebecca. Thank you very much. And I hope you're going to come and talk to RAG properly when we can do it. Well.
I would love to. This has been a really interesting discussion, and that's a very nice way of thinking about my work. So thank you very much for that. I really appreciate it.
Wonderful.